All right, so in this lecture, I want to talk about substance abuse disorders and specifically their diagnosis. Before we talk about the actual disorders themselves, it's important to talk about some of the terminology that I might be using and some of the terminology that you'll see in the textbook discussion of these topics. So when we look at discussions of substance use disorders, the first thing is that people often talk about is the idea of substance intoxication. And really all that means is a specific set of changes that people experience whenever they use a drug. So if you think about someone using alcohol, for example, and whenever that person is feeling a bit tipsy or sluggish or lack of having trouble coordinating, stumbling around, or doing a whole bunch of those silly things that people tend to do whenever they are in fact drunk or under the influence, all of that is substance intoxication. So whenever anybody talks about what does a specific drug do, that's talking about really the intoxication effect. When we talk about these drugs, we might also talk about withdrawal. And withdrawal is really the kind of a set of negative side effects or negative effects that people might feel when they don't get the drug that they need. So this might be both physical and psychological. And a good rule of thumb for this is that the withdrawal of a substance is usually the opposite of what that substance does. So if we talk about alcohol, for example, alcohol is a depressant. It slows down our central nervous system. So what happens is as our central nervous system, our brain starts to slow down, the more and more alcohol we have, that's where we get the sluggishness, the difficulty maintaining focus, the difficulty being able to speak, all of those problems. And eventually with alcohol, this is where we get people passing out, not being able to maintain consciousness. So if we look at the withdrawal for people from alcohol, quite often what we're going to see, instead of the slow down or the depression of the central nervous system, we're going to see it actually being sped up. So if we look at people who have problems with alcohol, you'll see that they'll be shaking, they'll be jittery, they will have trouble sitting still, and that's all part of that central nervous system coming to arousal. Basically, when you think about withdrawal, we're using substances for a long time. Our brain doesn't like to be kind of shifted out of its normal state of functioning. And in order to maintain homeostasis, it's going to try to accommodate for whatever it is that we throw at it. So somebody who drinks alcohol, they're constantly slowing down their central nervous system. And so now it kind of has to work a bit harder. And if we reliably drink alcohol all the time, what the brain is going to say is, I know this is coming. So in anticipation, like I know you're going to slow me down. So in anticipation, I'm going to speed up so that alcohol plus this sped up central nervous system, that's going to equal normal. And when we look at people who are using substances for a long time, we'll often hear them talk about the idea that they're not using them any longer to get a high or feel drunk. They're using them to feel normal, because as the brain adapts to having a substance, then it's going to have that. And that's why we develop tolerance. So tolerance is when we need more and more of the same drug in order to feel the effects of that drug. So as we adapt to the drug, as we start counteracting it, then that drug is having less and less effect. So maybe one beer used to make you tipsy and now it takes 3. That's your brain adjusting for the presence of alcohol to maintain your homeostasis. Now imagine that you all of a sudden stop drinking and you don't take in that alcohol. Well, the brain is still adjusting, the body is still adjusting, so it's speeding up in anticipation of alcohol, and when that doesn't happen, that's when we get the withdrawal. That's when all those symptoms, the opposite of what the drug actually does, come through, and we see people experiencing these unpleasant symptoms. So if you are a coffee drinker, for example, you might be familiar with withdrawal, and I have a cup of coffee here, so I'm with you. But quite often people who drink coffee, when you don't have your coffee, one of the things that people experience are headaches, and that's a symptom of withdrawal from headaches. Also, it might be when you first started drinking coffee, you might have, felt a little jittery, kind of overstimulated after like a cup or two. But if you're a regular drinker, you can drink a cup of coffee and not feel too much of an effect and maybe be able to go to sleep right after. That's an indication that your body has developed tolerance. So if we look at the previous DSM and how substance problems were diagnosed in that DSM, it tended to separate the diagnoses into kind of different parts. First, there was the substance abuse diagnosis, and what this diagnosis was for was really when people were using substances, any substance, and it was harmful consequences really is what it focused on. So really it's focused on not being able to meet your obligations, getting in trouble, maybe being in hazardous situations. So for example, if you drink and drive, that's one of those kind of things. Having legal problems, so if you lose your license, social problems, if your girlfriend, boyfriend, spouse leaves you, or if you leave your job, something like that. All of those different things were part of the substance abuse diagnosis. Substance dependence, on the other hand, is a diagnosis that was used for people who had trouble with withdrawal and with tolerance. So this is when they physiologically experience symptoms. So the previous DSM separated the two. Substance abuse did not require you to experience the withdrawal and tolerance and the negative physiological and psychological effects. Substance abuse was just that you're being kind of irresponsible with the use of the substance, and you may or may not have dependence issues. You just are using in a way that is dangerous. Dependence was only given as a diagnosis to people who really did experience those symptoms of tolerance and withdrawal from the whatever substance was at issue. Now, with the new DSM, what they decided to do is they decided to put those two together. So really, we have one main diagnosis that's available for us in the DSM-5, and this is kind of the current way that we diagnose that. And what that diagnosis is it's called a substance use disorder. So substance use disorder is technically defined as a maladaptive pattern of recurrent use of a substance. So again, look back at when we talk about what disorders are. This is a pattern of behavior. It's maladaptive. So this is not just a one-time use that somebody uses a drug and now they have a substance use disorder. In fact, the time here is that this has been going on for at least 12 months or longer. And there's a bunch of symptoms that a person might have, and the requirement is that someone has 2 or more symptoms. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, but the more symptoms that someone has, the more severe the diagnosis. So the symptoms include basically the symptoms of abuse and dependence from the previous DSM. And I'm going to show you a graphic in just a second that kind of puts all those symptoms together. But first, people who have this diagnosis might use whatever the substance is in larger amounts than they intended to. So you thought you might just have a drink, but instead you end up having 20. That is definitely one of the symptoms. Often people might say, I want to stop. I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to stop smoking. I'm going to stop using whatever the substance is. So they make that plan and then they can't, and then they fail. So there's unsuccessful stopping of the substance. That's part of the problem as well. The other thing that we see is people experience a craving or a desire, and that's part of that kind of need for the substance. It's wanting it, thinking about it. People will often spend a lot of time thinking about like when are they going to get their next substance, and they might talk about it. They might kind of dream about it if they're not having it. There's lots of planning that goes into it as well to make sure that you have the substance. People will use the substance despite problems. So even though it might be interfering in your life, even though it might be causing difficulty in your relationship, even though you are not doing well in school, you're still continuing to use a substance. That's one of the symptoms of substance use disorder. People might be giving up more important activities in life. So maybe you were going to go out with your friends, but instead you went looking for whatever the substance might be. That's an issue. That's what the symptom would look like. So this is kind of changing your life to accommodate the substance. People are putting themselves in dangerous situations. So this might be driving, operating heavy machinery. It might be going to inject yourself with drugs in dangerous places. Or it might be sometimes people will do various kinds of things in order to get money to be able to get the drug. So if you're continually putting yourself into dangerous situations to get the drug, that's part of the symptomology. Tolerance, I already talked about. Withdrawal, I already talked about. So all of these are symptoms, and notice these are all kind of the abuse and dependent symptoms put together into one diagnosis. And you need to have 2 or more of these symptoms occurring in a pattern for 12 months or longer. So just to show you how these compare to the previous diagnoses, here's a kind of a nifty table. And what we see here is right over here, there is the list of hazardous use, social and interpersonal problems related to use, neglected major roles to use, and legal problems. The red here is the old substance abuse diagnosis. The black letters here, that's the old substance dependence diagnosis. And then there's also this craving symptom, and that's something that was added, and especially for drugs like marijuana or cannabis, inhalants and hallucinogens. Those did not include that kind of symptom in the past. So if we look at the DSM-5 substance use disorders, this last column, you're going to see that all of these different symptoms are part of that, except for the legal problems. Like that's not necessarily a thing. So you don't have to have legal problems in order to be qualifying for this diagnosis. And it's probably going to legal problems falls in under social interpersonal problems that are related to use and or putting yourself in dangerous situations. So both of those are kind of part of that. So what we see is there's a bunch of these symptoms that can come together, and research really showed that the 2 diagnoses, the abuse and dependence, weren't so different that we needed 2, and so that's why it was changed to just having 1 diagnosis. Now, as I mentioned, the number of symptoms that someone has actually does influence the severity of the actual diagnosis. So we can, in diagnosis, specify how severe that disorder is. And really, this depends on the number of symptoms. So it's mild if someone has 2 to 3 symptoms. It is moderate 4 to 5. And then if you have 6 or more, then that's severe. So basically, all those symptoms, that's a severe diagnosis. When we diagnose also, we can specify if a person is currently experiencing those symptoms or if they are in remission. So for example, someone who might have had an issue, went into treatment and is now kind of very early in that treatment and not using the substances, they might get a diagnosis of an early remission. Or someone who's been not using substance for a long time and maintaining that might be given a specifier of a sustained remission. So when we diagnose someone with a substance use disorder, we're going to give them a diagnosis of substance use disorder, but we're going to specify which substance. So that's how you get a bunch of different diagnoses when it's really just the one diagnosis with a specification. So the DSM recognizes 10 different classes of drugs. So these are 10 different classes of substances for which someone can have a substance use disorder. So for example, the first one is alcohol. So you can have alcohol use disorder or caffeine use disorder. So we can specify those diagnoses, and all the symptoms would be relevant to that particular drug. So we have alcohol, caffeine, cannabis, hallucinogens, inhalants, opiates, sedatives, hypnotics or anxiolytics, so tranquilizer kinds of drugs. Anxiolytics are the Xanax kinds of drugs that we talked about previously. Tobacco, and the other. And the other category includes just, there's a bunch of drugs that are created in a lab. There's like some drugs that might not fit into any one of these categories. All of those would be under the other. Most of the time, though, when we talk about substances, we don't talk about them necessarily as in these 10 categories. We're going to talk about them in the categories of their shared effect. So, for example, some of the drugs are depressants. I mentioned alcohol as a depressant. So all these drugs are going to slow down our central nervous system. So, for example, drugs like alcohol, sedatives, hypnotics are all going to be sedatives. And so most often when we talk about substances, we talk about them in those kinds of categories. Caffeine, cocaine, those kinds of drugs are going to be stimulants. So they're going to speed up central nervous system. So in the next segment, I'm going to talk about different types of drugs and their effects and dangers and so on and so forth. And we're going to divide them into those particular categories. But just to be aware, these 10 are the way that the DSM tends to divide them.